22 prisons, 1 secure training centre, and 96 probation delivery units. The team that I lead coordinates the ministry of around 1,250 chaplains from 22 different faith and belief traditions. I'm conscious that this is the post-lunch slot, for which I apologise. But if I see anyone with their eyes closed, I will simply assume they're pondering deeply what I have to say. But if your neighbour starts snoring, please just prod them gently. We're going to look at 4 sections this afternoon. Firstly, looking at history. How have we come to be where we are today in these 2 nations? What is the series of events which have led us to provide care in this way? Next, we're going to consider what it is that chaplains in England and Wales actually do. In what ways do they care for prisoners and staff? Thirdly, we're going to look at caring for chaplains, asking who cares for the carers? And finally, we're going to look at some underlying principles which underpin what we do. At the end of the first 3 sections, there are some questions for you to consider. You could discuss them with a neighbour for a few minutes if you're here in person, or simply just ponder them yourself if you're watching online. And at the end of the final session, there will be an opportunity for you to ask me any questions that you might like to. My apologies to chaplains who have been active in prison ministry in England and Wales. Much of what I say will be at best old news and may indeed give you an opportunity to ponder and correct me later on how I've misrepresented the work that you do. So, firstly, a history of care in England and Wales. Excellent. Some time ago, someone asked me, when did the church start getting involved in prisons? My response was, you're asking the wrong question. The right question is, when did the state start getting involved in what the church was already doing in prisons? In 1151, the Bishop of Winchester opened the Clink, probably the oldest recorded prison for both men and women in England, next to his London residence. It was used as a home for people awaiting trial for a variety of offences, including heresy and non-payment of debts. The name Clink has been used as a slang term for prison ever since, and it lasted over 600 years, finally closing in 1780. However, whilst it might have been an institution founded by a bishop, it could not exactly be described as a demonstration of the church's care for those in prison. In fact, it was a pretty horrific environment, as any visitor to the modern-day museum which stands on the site will tell you. In order to find a more positive example of the involvement of people of faith, we need to look to the 18th century and to characters such as John Howard, whom you've already heard about more than once from the prisons minister, a Calvinist who inspected his local prison in Bedford and took a number of issues to Parliament, including intervening on behalf of those who were unable to pay the jailer's fee, a sum of money paid by a prisoner or their family for their upkeep whilst in prison. But it is to this lady, Elizabeth Fry, that many prison chaplains look as their main forebear. Horrified by the conditions in Newgate Prison on a visit there in 1813, she was instrumental in a number of pieces of legislation to improve the lives of prisoners, among them the 1823 Jails Act, which provided segregation of prisoners according to gender and the provision of female warders to care for female prisoners, thereby protecting them from exploitation. Prison chaplains and people of faith have been working to care for prisoners ever since. In 1891, HMP Wormwood Scrubs opened in West London. Unlike other prisons of its era, which were built for the convenience of staff on a radial design, where the wings, like the spokes on a cartwheel, met at the central point, so that a single member of staff could stand at the centre and observe everything that was happening. Wormwood Scrubs consisted of 4 well-spaced wings running north to south, top to bottom in your picture. The thinking behind this was that the cell windows faced east and west, giving the occupants the maximum amount of sunlight. The modern wings running left to right at the bottom of your picture have been added later. The reason behind this thoughtful design? Wormwood Scrubs was a Christian foundation, designed, built, and operated on Christian principles. At the center of the prison, and clearly visible in the center of your picture, the magnificent chapel. We'll be having a look inside in a few moments' time. Another important marker of its Christian heritage. No execution has ever taken place at Wormwood Scrubs, the Christian heritage of the place holding sway on that particular policy as well. Sadly, the same cannot be said of other prisons of a similar era. Until the mid-1960s, it was the duty of the prison chaplain to accompany prisoners condemned to death in the days leading up to their death, and indeed accompany them, if they wished, on their final walk to the gallows. The one at Wandsworth Prison in South London, just a short journey from Wormwood Scrubs, is shown here. The chaplain would visit the condemned person regularly in the run-up to the fateful day, and if they so wished, would stay with them throughout the final night. One of my predecessors, the late Leslie Lloyd Rees, spoke very movingly in a television documentary I watched some years ago of how he would celebrate a service of Holy Communion with the condemned man in his cell on the morning of his execution, timing it so that he pronounced the final blessing just as the hangman walked through the door. Those of us in the prison service in England and Wales tend to think of our historical use of capital punishment in a rather matter-of-fact way. We acknowledge that it happened and are glad that it is not happening anymore. So I was given pause for thought when I visited Edinburgh Prison in Scotland, where there is clearly much more of a sense of shame that any such practice ever happened. Our first visit in that prison was to the memorial to the victims of capital punishment, where we kept a moment's silence. Looking back, it is impossible and unfair to judge the motives of colleagues who are, at the very least, long retired and for the most part no longer with us. But I hope that at best, it can be a sign of the willingness of chaplains to provide care and to walk alongside those who walk the darkest and most lonely path and stay with them until the very end. On to happier things, but only marginally. It was John Howard, whom we have already mentioned, who was a pioneer of the separate system. Prisoners spent their time in complete isolation, having to wear masks when they left their cells in order that they might not see, let alone speak to another prisoner. It may seem to us, for indeed it was, a cruel and inhumane system, but the intention behind it was to allow time alone for the prisoner to reflect on their wrongdoings and to repent before God without distraction from others. The actual result in many cases was that the prisoner was driven mad by the loneliness and isolation. The one time that prisoners were allowed to remove their masks was in chapel, a daily requirement for all prisoners. The picture is of the chapel in the old Lincoln Castle prison, although a couple of our prison chapels still in use are not entirely dissimilar. Once each prisoner was seated in their stall with the door closed, they could remove their mask, as looking ahead, they could see only the chaplain and the governor standing at the front of the chapel. The masks, of course, needed to be replaced before they moved out of their stall and on to the day's hard labor. Not all prison chapels are quite so forbidding and austere. I promised you a look inside Wormwood Scrubs Chapel, and here it is. This beautiful and inspiring space is still in use today for Christian services and other activities. A closer look reveals that the icons intricately painted on the wall behind the high altar are in fact painted on mail bags. These, like the rest of the chapel, were created by the first prisoners to be held there, using in many cases whatever resources they had to hand. In this case, the mail bags that they were at other times made to sew as forced labor. It gives the chapel its strange and not unpleasant atmosphere as a cross between a medieval basilica and a gospel hall. The chapel is, of course, Anglican, Church of England, although you wouldn't necessarily know it by looking at it. For many
Pas
years,
à première vue, pendant de longues années, pour les aumôniers de prison, il n'y avait que la foi anglicane.
there may have been in a few prisons a separate, much less grand and ornate space for Roman Catholics, as indeed there was in Wormwood Scrubs, although it's now been converted into a mosque, about which more in a moment. Uniquely, HMP Pentonville in North London, because of the large Jewish population there was and still is, a synagogue. But apart from that, you were either Church of England or Church in Wales, remembering where we are, or, well, that was the only option, really. As time went on, the design of faith spaces evolved alongside the design of the rest of the prison. For many years, and indeed until fairly recently, we were still building specifically Christian worship spaces, but ones which could be used by all Christian denominations. The one shown here at Belmarsh Prison in East London, built in the 1990s, right at the heart of the prison. And just to show that I'm not entirely London focused, this one from HMP Wymot in Lancashire in the northwest of England, although I'm told that it's a rather old photo of that chapel. But in recent years, we've started to accommodate worship from a variety of different faiths. Often, this is done through the use of a multi-faith space. This has the advantage of fairness, a shared sacred space belonging to all. But they can, if we're not careful, become somewhat bland, nondescript sort of spaces, which are not really ideal for anyone. Those of you visiting HMP Berwyn later this week will see a different approach. 2 large rooms are decked out with the symbols and artifacts of all the numerically larger world faiths, and those who worship do so facing towards their own particular areas, but alongside the signs and symbols of a variety of other faiths. It's provoked criticism and commendation in equal measure, and it will be interesting to hear what you make of it when you visit. In other places, we've created faith-specific worship spaces, particularly where we have a large population of one faith in a particular place. This one is a mosque in Swinfen Hall in Staffordshire. Here is a Buddha grove in HMP Spring Hill in Buckinghamshire, complete with Buddhist monk. And finally, a Hindu temple. And for that, we go back to, yes, you've guessed it, Wormwood Scrubs. It was my predecessor, but one, the Venerable William Noblet, Chaplain General from 2001 to 2011, who had a vision for prison chaplaincy in England and Wales, which was completely multi-faith. He worked to create a system of equal opportunity, where the needs of prisoners of all faiths were respected and fulfilled, and where chaplains of all faiths could work on equal terms within the service. Being a pioneer in this area has both its joys and its challenges. There was no example to follow, no plan to adapt for our use. Initially, work was done with the 6 major world faiths, although over time this has broadened to the 22 different faith and belief groups I mentioned at the start. The pictures on the screen represent just a few of these faiths, beliefs, and denominations. Although that, of course, is not the full picture. We count pagan as one faith group, but acknowledging that this represents a huge variety of different groups, from Druid to Wiccan to heathen, and so on. The many and various Christian denominations are distilled down into just a few, although the designation Free Church covers something in the region of 27 different denominations. I think that's right. Bob will no doubt correct me later. Each of these different faith group and belief groups will have their own structures and hierarchies, or lack of them, their own policies and their own views on some of the key issues that people of faith continue to wrestle with: the role of women in leadership, human gender and sexuality, and so on, as well as their own approach to employment, contracts, and remuneration, especially when it is by a secular organization such as the prison service. There are two stories to be told here. One at an organizational level, where leaders, managers, and advisors seek to work out policy, procedure, and finance. This is not necessarily a tale of acrimony, although like all human institutions, we're not immune to this. But it is somewhere where constant negotiation, redrafting, and redesigning is needed to provide a structure which works for everyone, most importantly, providing the care required for the children, women, and men who live in our prisons and are looked after by our probation service. It is the one that takes up much of my time and energy, as well as that of several people within my team. It is vital work if we are to continue to pursue the dream of multi-faith chaplaincy, which really does care for people of all faiths and beliefs and none. But if we're not careful, it can blind us to the reality on the ground, which is a different and much more positive story. In our prisons, this story is of a group of people whose views and opinions could not be more different. People from different races and backgrounds, and from religious groups which have consistently been at odds with one another, not just coexisting, but working together as friends and colleagues. We see chaplains putting their own needs second to ensure that the religious practices and traditions of others are respected. We see prisoners of one faith being cared for by a chaplain of another, interacting as fellow human beings to meet a need. It's a strong and inspiring message which is sent loud and clear to prisoners, and I hope beyond, that the narratives of hatred and division do not have to hold sway. That difference does not necessarily mean division. That disagreement does not have to equal conflict. That I don't have to agree with you just to be your friend. And in recent years, another tradition has joined our numbers. We've been working with Humanists UK and the Non-Religious Pastoral Support Network to provide non-religious chaplains and pastoral carers to provide support. This would be especially useful for those who would find it helpful to discuss things with someone of a similar mindset to themselves. But like all other chaplains, they work as a team, providing support to people of all faiths and beliefs and none. It's a controversial move, and one which has received no small measure of criticism from those who are worried that it will mean the end of chaplaincy and the end of religious practice in our prisons. There was a time when I may have been of a similar opinion myself, but as is so often the case, I've had the opportunity to work with people from this group and have seen the way in which they sensitively, considerately interact with their colleagues to work as a team, providing care to everyone. And I welcome the next step in our evolution as prison service chaplaincy in England and Wales. We've come a long way since Elizabeth Fry and John Howard. On the screen is a map of the prisons in England and Wales, with London taken out in the top right, looking like a separate island, which is sometimes how it feels. It's too small for you to see the detail, but you can see the spread of establishments and notably the absence of anything in central or northwest Wales, where we are currently. Prisons in white, contracted or private sector prisons in grey, women's prisons in dark purple, long-term high security in red, and the youth custody estate in pink. This PowerPoint presentation, like all the others, will be available after the conference for you to look at in more detail. Our newest prison, which doesn't appear on this map, HMP Foss Way, operated by Serco, opened last week and is filling up with prisoners at the rate of 5 a week. Our oldest dating back to Napoleonic times, with a large number of establishments from the century before last, including some which we've mentioned already this afternoon, now looking at best a little tired and dated. In each one is a team of chaplains who seek to care for everyone within their walls and fences, of every faith and none. They're conscious of their history, but also keen to move on from it and to try new things. And in the next section, we'll look at what they currently do. But first, some questions for you to ponder or to discuss with a neighbour. Here we go. How has the history of the establishment or nation in which you work affected the way in which chaplaincy works today? And secondly, what can be done to overcome the effects of a difficult or troubling history? We'll just take a few moments, if you wish to discuss with those around you before I move on. Our next section looks in a bit more detail at how prison chaplains in England and Wales care for prisoners and staff. It was the 1952 Prisons Act which mandated a chaplain in every prison, Anglican, of course, but since then, as we know, times have changed. From that time on, there have been set duties which must be performed by a chaplain, and several areas of prison life where a chaplain is an integral part of the process. These structures ensure that not just that care is available, but that it is written into the very fabric of the criminal justice system. There are a number of statutory duties which must be performed by a chaplain by law. But alongside this, and perhaps most importantly, chaplains are a presence on the wings and landings. There is no part of a prison where a chaplain does not go, no aspect of prison life which is off limits to them, no place or meeting or occasion where the presence of a chaplain is a surprise. It's my view that the COVID pandemic taught us an important lesson. Deprived of services and classes, but nonetheless present at the request of the government, chaplains spent their time on the wings and the landings. When other agencies had left and gone
Alors que
home,
d'autres intervenants sont rentrés chez eux et que les
chaplains were there, providing emotional and pastoral support to the stretched and fearful staff, a visible sign that we really do care. "You're still here," was a comment made by more than one member of staff, impressed and supported by the pastoral presence of chaplains on the wings. When men and women and children were locked in their cells 23 hours a day, chaplains were there at the door, offering encouragement and reassurance that they had not been forgotten, saving, without any shadow of a doubt, countless lives. When those in our care were unable to attend corporate worship and study, chaplains were there, providing printed resources, praying with people, uploading sermons and worship materials onto the digital hub for those who had that facility. When people who had dying relatives or loved ones who had died, chaplains were there, facilitating Zoom calls on iPads, enabling prisoners to watch live-streamed funerals and feel that they were a part of the process, even if they were prevented from attending. It was a reminder to all of us of the value of presence, that talent that chaplains have of an incidental conversation. Are you okay? You don't look too good. Do you want to chat? That conversation which saves a life, which is the bread and butter of the prison chaplain. And we were reminded during COVID of just how important it is. Of course, not all our conversations are incidental. Every prisoner coming into a prison must be seen by a chaplain within 24 hours, both on reception into the first prison and then on arrival at every other prison that they are subsequently transferred to. This conversation establishes as a matter of process a prisoner's religion and ensures that it is registered correctly, making them aware of the services and groups that are available for their participation. But far more than this, that initial conversation establishes that there is someone in that faceless institution who cares about them, who is interested in their welfare. It lays the foundation for a relationship, for trust, for care. This is maintained during other statutory visits. When prisoners are segregated due to poor or disruptive behaviour, they are visited on a daily basis by a chaplain. This visit, which could be considered a perfunctory tick box exercise, is far from being so. It's a reminder in a dark place that somebody cares, that the prisoner is not forgotten, that they are not alone. Similarly, in establishments which have a residential healthcare unit, the daily visit from a chaplain provides an anchor in a bewildering and painful situation, given that the majority of prisoners kept in our residential healthcare units are there for mental rather than physical infirmities. Perhaps more expected is a chaplain's involvement in the delivery of faith services and groups. No, try the other way. There we go. Perhaps more expected is the correct picture. The chaplain's involvement in the delivery of faith services and groups. Every prisoner is entitled to an hour's corporate worship and an hour's faith study per week. For the numerically larger faiths, these are at predictable times. Friday prayers for Muslims, Sunday service for Anglican and Free Church Christians, and for Roman Catholics, the Mass takes place whenever a priest is
Ou pour les catholiques, souvent en cas de disponibilité d'un prêtre.
a Bible study, Quran class, and a variety of other groups which take place during the week. For our numerically smaller friends, Sikh, Hindu, pagan, Jew, Rastafarian, and so on, a 2-hour slot is generally found at some point during the week, subject to the availability of a chaplain who may well serve several prisons. Chaplains are skilled in the most extreme form of mixed ability teaching, with a group of individuals for whom, for some, simply staying in the room for an hour is an achievement, while others are working towards a degree-level theology qualification. But the classes can be inspiring, creative, and joyful, and the worship can be uplifting and spiritual in a way that you wouldn't necessarily find in your local church. Or it could just be an exercise in crowd control. It very much depends on the day. I sometimes comfort myself if there are disruptive people in the congregation with the thought that they do not know how to behave in church, and yet they are there. They would have chosen to come to worship when outside a prison. It might be the last place you would expect to find them. Who knows what God might do now they are there? Chaplains are equally active during times of crisis. When prisoners suffer bereavements, chaplains are involved in the provision not just of pastoral care, but also in the practical arrangements, organising a visit to the hospital bedside to say goodbye to a dying relative, and organising a visit to the funeral. It's the role of a chaplain to break bad news, never quite knowing what reaction they are going to get. Most chaplains have seen the full range from angry denial to resigned acceptance, from tears to relief. And through that moment and beyond, Chaplains have an overview of the whole process, liaising with hospital, funeral director, family, coroner, and providing all the required information to ensure that security are satisfied and that accompanying staff are able to be safe. Chaplains must have one eye on the pastoral care of those involved, not just the prisoner, but also the escorting staff. More about care for staff later on. And one eye on the practical arrangements, using their knowledge of the system and the prison environment to ensure that everything runs smoothly as far as possible. Care of a bereaved person can take many months or indeed years if someone is with us that long. Patient caring is always the order of the day. Destructive patterns of behavior are sadly not uncommon in times of crisis in prison. Self-harm is encountered on a regular basis, from someone who makes minor cuts or scratches to someone whose self-inflicted injuries go as far as endangering their life. And our colleagues in the female estate see some of the most extreme examples. When someone is considered at risk of self-harm or suicide, they are subject to the ACT process, standing for assessment, care in custody, and teamwork, where interactions are recorded and a care plan put in place. Chaplains visit these prisoners at least on a weekly basis, sometimes much more frequently, as well as taking part in formal reviews and bringing their experience to bear in decisions which affect the person in question. Tragically, from time to time, either as part of a pattern of self-harm or completely unexpectedly, a prisoner will take their own life. In 2022, 74 people committed suicide in the prisons of England and Wales. Each one is a tragedy, not just for the person whose life is unnecessarily cut short, and for the family, friends, and loved ones of that individual, but also for the prison community, cellmates, those who share the wing or landing, and indeed staff feel the loss keenly. And the chaplain is no exception. But care must be provided in the midst of grief in both active ways, visiting the family to break the news, either accompanying or being the family liaison officer, but also in more passive ways as ministry of presence, listening, blessing, wiping away the tears. Very often, chaplains find themselves as witnesses in a coroner's hearing, giving an account of what they did, who they spoke to, and what they recorded. A grueling experience, but an opportunity too to provide care for colleagues going through the same traumatic experience. So far, we've assumed that the prisoners we are dealing with are compliant and that the care offered is well received. But what if that is not the case? Prisoners can be disruptive, destructive, and aggressive. Dealing pastorally with prisoners who are openly hostile, especially those who are presenting as violent or protesting in unpleasant and antisocial ways, can test the best of us. Thankfully, assaults on chaplains are still extremely rare, although I have myself been on the receiving end of a punch to the face on one occasion. Thankfully, it didn't spoil my good looks. But all of us have regularly encountered the volatile, aggressive, and unpleasant prisoner who set out to make our day much worse than it could otherwise be. Buried deep within them is a child of God. In caring for them, we seek to find it and help them to find their way out of the current place of despair and destruction. One-to-one conversations can happen at the most unexpected times and in the most unexpected places. A conversation struck up with someone leaning over a railing can develop into an in-depth discussion about faith, a sharing of concerns, and an unburdening of hurts and fears. One of the great joys and privileges of being a chaplain is that you can talk to anyone, no one and nowhere is off limits. It's not unusual to move from speaking to a prisoner in the segregation unit to speaking to the governor in their office within the space of a few minutes, and nobody ever questions it. Anyone else moving from conversing with prisoners to chatting to staff with such regularity would be labelled a gross, a telltale by prisoners, and a security risk by staff. But for chaplains, it's accepted without question. For all but just under 100 of the 85,000 or so prisoners currently held in prisons in England and Wales, the day will come sooner or later when the gate opens and they walk through it back into the community. A visit to all prisoners by a chaplain prior to their release completes the list of statutory duties for a chaplain. The prospect of release is not always the joyful one that we might sometimes imagine. Insecurities about the outside world loom large, especially when someone has been inside for a long time. Will family relationships and friendships have endured? Will I be able to avoid going back to my old ways? How will I cope on my own when for so long everything has been done for me and every decision has been made on my behalf? A chance to talk these concerns over with a chaplain, to develop coping strategies and allay irrational fears can make a real difference, not just to a person's well-being in that moment, but also to their chances of staying out of prison. The discharge visit is a tricky balance. I grow frustrated with chaplains who initiate conversations about housing and employment when they have no resources to offer and serve only to raise false hope. But more and more, chaplains are able to bring resources to that conversation, to provide real hope and a solution to some of these intractable situations.
Vrais espoirs et de vraies solutions à de telles difficultés.
What we care for are just that, whole people who have a life before and after prison, as well as the bit that we see whilst accompanying them through their sentence. In England and Wales, we're being asked to remember that we are one HMPPS, His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, there to provide for people when they leave prison, while they're under community supervision, resident in an approved premises or under some other form of probation supervision. What does this mean for chaplaincy? How can we as chaplains provide care into these situations too? These are questions that for the most part we are only just beginning to ask. Although in some prisons and some parts of England and Wales, including here in Wales and the northwest of England, some work has been ongoing to provide chaplaincy support for those who have left prison. We have much to learn about what works and what doesn't. For old dogs like me with many years of prison experience, this is decidedly a new trick. But we're keen to learn and develop and grow our chaplaincy service so that it can care for more people, providing the right resources are available for us to do so. What is definitely true is that in this endeavour, we will need the help of the cooperation of existing community organisations, community chaplaincy projects, and organisations and places of worship. There is already much good work going on, and we need to find a way of complementing it rather than duplicating it. Prisoners who have found or renewed a faith in prison often need help to find a supportive faith community in which to settle, one where they know they're going to be welcomed and not made to feel like they don't fit in. But how to find these welcoming communities? Prison Service Chaplaincy is proud to support the Welcome Directory, a charity who work to maintain an up-to-date database of faith communities who will work to offer a welcome to those leaving prison and those on probation. As well as producing and maintaining this list, the charity runs a very well-received prison awareness course, enabling members of that church, mosque, gurdwara, and so on, to learn a little bit about what those they will be welcoming will have been through, and develop some strategies for welcoming them effectively and helping them to settle in. I think that supporting the Welcome Directory is the single most important contribution that we as chaplaincy can make towards the resettlement of those leaving prison. Much of what we've already said about supporting prisoners can also be said about supporting staff. It's my experience, and I suspect the experience of other chaplains in England and Wales, that they have to keep reminding the establishment that they are there for staff as well. While, in fact, as a managing chaplain in particular, I probably spent more time with staff than I did with prisoners. And it's not really surprising. Staff do an incredibly demanding job, both physically and mentally, as they seek to care for and keep in order some of society's most challenging and damaged individuals. In recent years as a service, we've been quite good at recruitment, much less good at retention, as staff quickly come to believe that the role is not for them and seek out alternative, less demanding roles, often for similar pay. Time spent with staff is often rewarding and sometimes surprising. The hard-as-nails officer with many years of service who puts on a brave face on the wing but breaks down in tears in the chaplain's office. Remember, I always tell students on our new starters course, the issues you are dealing with prisoners affect staff as well: bereavement, pain, loss, addiction, and so on. Pay attention to the staff too. Don't just let them fade into the background. The small acts of care and service that a chaplain can perform, which are appreciated more than we could ever imagine, remembering that, as is the case for the prisoners, we are often their only link to faith. I remember having served for a number of years at HMP Chelmsford, watching as the staff filed into a room for a full staff briefing from the governor. As the staff members came through the door, I noted in my head, I buried your mother, I baptized your children, I married you. It was a real surprise to me just how far-reaching a simple ministry of presence can go and how much it is appreciated and made use of. So we finish this section with a few questions for us either to ponder on our own or discuss with a neighbour. Are there other areas not mentioned here where chaplains are involved and active in your context? To what extent do you see yourself? Does your employer see you as a chaplain to prisoners and staff? We'll just take a few moments. In this section, we're going to take a brief look at who cares for the carers. How do we care for chaplains in England and Wales? Whilst the role of the chaplain has evolved considerably over the last 100 years or so, it remains a pressured role. We no longer have to face the awful stress of accompanying a prisoner to the gallows. Neither do we generally have to campaign to ensure that prisoners are fed, although food remains a major part of our role. In most places too, there is some form of team with whom to share the burden, colleagues to discuss the work of the day, more experienced members of the team to help the less experienced. Although, of course, colleagues can bring their own stress when the team does not work out well and relationships become strained. The administrative burden on chaplains is greater than ever, and getting the paperwork right is essential when you remember that what you write could be read out in court, and you may live to regret that rash comment written in the heat of the moment after dealing with a challenging individual. Almost all administration is done on the computer. If that's your natural mode of operation, then that's a relief. But for many, it's a source of frustration. In my last prison, we were blessed to have Bob, who set up some amazing spreadsheets to perform some of our daily tasks. The team would find imaginative ways of breaking them so that he had something to fix the next time he came in. Part of the role of both headquarters advisors and managing chaplains is to maintain perspective, to be constant reminders of what is important in the midst of multiple calls upon our time and energy. The demand of paperwork and updating the computer system can be overwhelming, and it is a discipline to get up from the desk, to walk onto a wing and speak to a prisoner. And of course, when we do so, we are rewarded with a sense of the true value of our work, that life-changing, life-saving nature of chaplaincy, of which we are all rightly proud. But as well as the day-to-day burden upon chaplains, there are moments of crisis, tragic events, deaths in custody, and moments of extreme violence where chaplains are called upon to support the whole prison community. They become the receptacles for the emotional baggage of others. But to whom do they offload? Where do they go for support? As a headquarters team, our principal role is to support the chaplains in our care. Phone calls and regular visits to enable listening and reflection, keeping in touch at times of difficulty or crisis, and hopefully enabling chaplains to feel they are not alone.
Se sentir un peu moins seul. Voici
At Newbold Revel near Rugby, right in the centre of England. Throughout the year, there are training courses for chaplains run here by my colleague Phil, who is our training and development officer. It may seem strange, it may not, to equate training with support and care. But in order to care well, we need to be well resourced. We need to know that what we are doing. Our courses range from new starters, an introductory course for new chaplains, going through the basics of prison chaplaincy. There are specific courses for managing chaplains and also a number of pastoral care and counselling skills courses. The courses are delivered as teaching, of course, but also in an environment which is hopefully relaxing and provides some space away from the immediate pressures of the prison situation. As you can see, the setting is not unpleasant. It's a requirement written into the job description of each chaplain to take care of their own spiritual well-being. For many, this comes in the form of an annual retreat, whether it is Muslim chaplains performing Hajj or Umrah, or free church chaplains climbing a mountain with Bob. Most of the time, these retreats can be taken in addition to the normal annual leave allocation, with some negotiation with a chaplain's line manager. In addition to this, there are conferences. Every other year, we gather together, all the chaplains of a particular faith and belief group, in a pleasant surrounding for 2 or 3 days of discussion, training, worship, and networking. The atmosphere of these conferences is relaxed, with free time given for refreshment and relaxation, a chance to recharge the batteries. In the intervening years, there is a conference for managing chaplains, which follows a similar model. In all of these, and I suppose like this conference, which we are all currently taking part, the main speaking events are important. But what is really important are the conversations which take place over dinner, in the bar, and in the queue for coffee. It is there that we are reminded that we are not alone, that the situations that we face are faced by others as well, and they are challenged too. If we sometimes feel overwhelmed, it is not because we are weak or incompetent, but because what we do is difficult. It gives us that vital perspective which all of us need as a part of the care we give and receive. In addition to these structures, a number of chaplains have set up their own support groups and associations. The logos of 3 of these are on the screen, but the list is by no means exhaustive. The oldest and largest, the MCA, the Muslim Chaplains Association, has set out the patterns for others to follow. These organizations are chaplain-led. They set the agenda, organize the meetings, and set out a code of practice or terms of reference. As a headquarters team, we offer support where we can, but also try to allow space for chaplains to own the endeavor without feeling that someone from the center is watching them. So in many ways, chaplains are cared for, and this care then enables them to feel cared for by others when it works well. A couple more questions for you to ponder and discuss with those around you. Do you feel cared for by the organisation for which you work, your fellow chaplains, your own faith and belief community? We'll just take a few moments for discussion. In this final section, I want to briefly consider some underlying principles which relate to care. What is it that underpins and governs everything we do? What principles hold true for all of us? Of course, once again, I return to the issue of multi-faith working, which is so much at the very heart of everything we do in prison chaplaincy in England and Wales. As a theological student, I trained as part of the Cambridge Theological Federation, a whole group of Christian denominations who trained together despite significant theological or doctrinal differences. The motto of the Federation, roots down, walls down. The more rooted we are in our own tradition, the less defensive we need to be. The more secure we are, the more we are able to interact and collaborate with others who are different. The same holds true with multi-faith working. If we have strong enough roots in our own faith tradition, we don't need walls to protect us, or indeed that faith from others. We can enjoy learning from our colleagues, from the prisoners. We can enjoy celebrating the festivals of others. We can be inspired by their dedication. We can become, with care, a group of people from a diverse range of backgrounds, working towards a common good. Whenever I am in a prison on a Friday, I like to attend Friday prayers with the Muslim prisoners. I sit on the mat with them, having to consistently refuse the offer of a chair and listen to the sermon, and never fail to take away something which inspires and informs my own Christian faith. On some occasions, I'm honoured to be asked to address them. I always remind them that their dedication in their faith is an inspiration to others in theirs. No act of devotion is ever wasted. I remind them that we share a common ancestor in Abraham, that we are part of the same family, brothers and sisters before God. And like all families, we argue and squabble. The chaplaincy department can sometimes be a turbulent place, but at the heart of it is love and joy in one another. Because we are at heart all human beings, we share most of all a common humanity. Very little of what we do as chaplains sometimes has to do with faith and belief. When we're trying to sort out some phone credit for someone who has been bereaved, when we're listening to someone pour out their heart at their sense of failure as a father, a husband, or a son, when we're visiting someone who has just arrived in prison, checking if they're okay, whether anyone knows they're there, checking indeed if they know where they are, we very rarely mention God. From time to time, we might say, "Is it all right if I pray with you?" The answer, incidentally, is almost always yes. After all, just because people don't know about the love of God, it doesn't mean that they are not loved by God. But at other times, our interactions are more mundane and procedural. But the ability to do what we do, the inspiration which lies behind our ability to care, that is our faith and belief tradition. We're here, as Per suggested this morning, by vocation, by calling. All of which begs the question, I suppose, and perhaps as I reflect on it, this could have been where I started. What does good care look like? If the answer to the question, who cares, is we do, then what is it that we do? What is this care that we give? There is a job description for a chaplain within the prison service of England and Wales. It runs to several pages. I suspect that it may do within your own systems as well. But there is no real job description for a carer. But surely at its heart it is this: to put the other person at the centre, to put their needs first, to give them value and self-worth, to show that they are worth spending time on, spending energy on, to remind them that they are precious, and like all precious things, they are fragile and require gentle handling. For those of us who are Christian, of course, the ultimate example of care is in the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. Other faith traditions may find their inspiration somewhere else. Bob spoke yesterday evening of how we care because we are beneficiaries of the grace of God. It is that grace within us which enables us to seek to be Christ-like. And in seeking to be Christ-like, in seeking to model our life and ministry on that of Jesus, we acknowledge that we care. We also acknowledge that as creations of God, we too are precious. That is perhaps the hardest thing of all for some, to acknowledge that we need care. To truly care for others is to care for ourselves. To acknowledge the value of others is to acknowledge that we too have value. To take care of others is to care for ourselves. Who cares? We do. We care for others by also caring for ourselves. Good care also takes into account the system, the institution, the environment. We're not just chaplains to the people in the system, prisoners and staff. We are also chaplains to the system. It is our role to speak out against injustice, to speak to overturn unjust structures, to make the system itself fairer and more just, to speak truth to power. We are obedient first and foremost to our faith and belief tradition, but we have other callings on our obedience too. Our employers and managers and supervisors also demand our obedience, and it is important to keep these in perspective. And none of this is without risk. Good care takes risks. There is a chance in speaking out against injustice that we will become targets, that we will be opposed. It is not a recipe for popularity. My colleague in charge of training speaks of 3 possible reactions of a chaplain when in contact with power: to freeze, to please, or to tease. My apologies if they don't rhyme in the French translation. I've done all 3 of these at different times. I wonder if you have too. The first thing that most of us do initially when we encounter powerful structures is to freeze. We say nothing, keep ourselves to ourselves, keep as low profile as possible. The next thing that we do is to seek to please. We become like the others. We join in with the dirty jokes. We take part in the banter. We seek to fit in. But good care is to tease. To be
Le soin, c'est de taquiner dans le sens de faire partie d'une structure, mais en même temps d'avoir un autre.
Why are you doing that? What will be the consequences of that course of action? Have you considered how that will affect this group of people? Good care seeks to tease power, to encourage reflection, consideration, and change. It speaks out against injustice, but it is a critical friend of those who have power and those who have none. We can bend our energies and our enthusiasm to our environment, but never our principles. We're a team playing an away game, but some teams playing away games still do very well. So where do we go from here? Prison service chaplaincy in England and Wales is at a time of great change, and we face some significant challenges and some great opportunities. Working with people on probation is a great opportunity to expand the care that we are able to give, to work transformatively with people beyond their time in custody. Those principles of care will be similar outside of our own prison walls and fences, even with a change of environment. New structures of resourcing give us an opportunity to think about how chaplaincy teams are supplied with people, giving us the chance to overturn some old injustices. But alongside this is the challenge that money is not infinite. In fact, it's rather tight. Care for our finances, being good stewards of what we have, is essential. But we need to consider how we care for ourselves, and how do I, as chaplain general, ensure that chaplains are valued and cherished according to all the principles that I've just been talking about. In all of this, and in conclusion, I must say that I'm grateful for the care that I receive from my team, from chaplains across England and Wales, and those with whom I share in faith. It remains a great privilege to lead prison chaplaincy in England and Wales, and I hope by sharing a little of it, you have found something useful to reflect on as you return to your own situations. Thank you very much for listening.